From the nation's capital, this is the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast with your host, Rob Snowhite.
This is the 248th episode of the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast. This is part one of Stronghold featuring author Tucker Malarkey. Quick note, we lost Dr. Jones the night before this was recorded, so I was a bit of a mess. Sat back and let Tucker do most of the talking. Dr. Jones would have been 15 in January. He had a long life full of walking around in bow ties and barking at pretty much everybody and everything he encountered. It's very quiet in the house, and I have no one to talk to during the days when I'm home alone, not on the water. In this episode, Tucker and I will discuss her cousin Guido and when and why she decided to write a book about his exceptional life, one man's quest to save the world's wild salmon. Please read the book, hopefully before this and the next episode. If you haven't read the book, in this episode you'll learn all about salmon and their relationship to the environment. You'll learn about Tucker's family steelhead fishing on the Deschutes River. You're going to hear some crazy taimen stories as well. This is the first podcast I can think of that's been interrupted by a windstorm. The Wi-Fi on Tucker's end cut out halfway through, but I'm sure producer Jason is going to make it absolutely professional sounding. So let's talk to Tucker. We've got Tucker Malarkey with us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Rob.
And where are we checking in with you today?
I am in Berkeley, California.
Fantastic. And you said it's pretty windy there. Is it the Santa Anas?
It's, maybe a bit, although we don't get those so much up north. But yeah, it's crazy global warming weather. And we now have PG&E, shutting off electricity to avoid fires. So things have been a little crazy out here.
Yeah, a guy died last week when his oxygen machine
suddenly
turned off because it was plugged in. No warning.
Right, exactly. Yeah, crazy times.
Yeah. And for those listening who haven't taken a look at your picture on the back of the book, do you have a celebrity you most resemble? A doppelganger, possibly?
I don't know. Who are you thinking?
I don't know. You don't have a big online presence. There's only a couple of pictures of you.
I know. I don't. I'm a writer.
Right. You're too busy writing to be online.
I know. I mean, I have been told various things, but who knows? Yeah.
And so how long ago were you out here in the D.C. area?
So I went to Georgetown University, and then I stayed in Washington to work at the Post, Washington Post, for about 5 years, and kind of worked my way up from, just an entry-level job, to the foreign desk, to, and I was, in those days, they kind of trained you to do everything when you were a youngster. And so, I learned how to edit and write. And then I co-wrote a book with a columnist there called Sleepwalking Through History. And that was about the Reagan years and privatization and deregulation and another crazy political time.
Absolutely.
And from there, I decided I need to lose civilization for a while, and I went to Africa, and I was going to go just for a few months, but I stayed for over 2 years, one of them living off the coast of Kenya on an island that had no cars, barely electricity, and it was just heaven. And that's where I decided to write fiction, which is a decision nobody jumps up and down in excitement about. Maybe I could have only made that decision being so far away. But I applied to MFA programs from over in South Africa, actually. I was there at that point, and then went on to the Writers' Workshop in Iowa. And then have been writing, editing, and teaching since then. And primarily, I'm a novelist. My cousin's crazy tale inspired me to return to nonfiction.
It almost reads, when I start reading the book, I knew of Guido through Langdon Cook's book, Upstream.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it was reading as if this was a complete brilliantly fabricated person with this amazing ability and persona. And then you flip through and you're like, wait, there's pictures of him when he was a kid. Are these real pictures, or did she just scan the internet to find pictures to go with the story? You're like, no, this is an actual person.
I know. Honestly, even as a kid, I knew that Guido was unusual. We had like a pack of cousins that grew up summering in Oregon at our fishing cabins on the Deschutes River, in a pretty wild part of the river. Of all of our cousins, well, he was the oldest, but also he was just different, and different in that he was wild. And while we lived kind of wild when we were on that river, he was really wild and plugged into natural systems and had absolutely no interest in humans, really, and made very few concessions to be with people or to speak to them. So I thought he was wonderful because, as kids, you're sort of very aware of adults and others' judgments and this and that, and I was very sensitive, and I loved just checking out and following him around as he pursued snakes and lizards. And it was like being with a shaman. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it. His sensory awareness of the world. And, he told me at one point that he saw things from like 3,000 feet above, where he could kind of see the stories in the land, and where he understood enough about reptiles. It was all about herpetology in the beginning, but he understood enough about them to know where to find them. And then he had just this way of tuning in and being super quiet, and then just grabbing a snake or a lizard, and just poisonous. It didn't matter. And that fascination transferred to fish when he discovered fly fishing and the fish in our river, and they were even more mysterious and intriguing to him. And he devoted all of his time and attention to studying them. And, it's starting on this one river in the Pacific Northwest. He kind of spread out to other rivers as he got older, and his focus changed from the trout and steelhead in our river to Pacific salmon.
Do you feel that he was more animal-like than person-like, almost, in the way that trouble communicating with people, but he could be with the animals and completely at peace?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And he didn't, he was born into sort of a well-to-do, well-connected family that were always trying to, force him to go to tennis camp and to mind his manners and this and that. And he just paid no attention at all. And it wasn't even an issue for him. It was just like he looked at his mother and his father and just kind of shook his head and was like, nope, I'm off, And when he was little, he ran away continually, just didn't abide by the same laws and rules, didn't acknowledge them. And so had all kinds of scrapes with authority. And also something that distinguished him a bit was he was dyslexic, badly dyslexic, which was discovered, in fourth grade. And obviously this didn't do much for his interest in school, and they didn't have as many, accommodations then as they do now. But when they discovered this, he started getting tutored after school, and I think, he was already isolated, and this increased his sense of isolation from other kids who already thought he was weird, Yeah. What he did have, though, was this visual sense. He had a teacher, I think it was in kindergarten, this is in the book, who gave the kids an exercise to kind of draw what they imagine the insides of a human being to be. And Guido, most kids had like scribbles of, tummies and this and that. And Guido's had like intestines and organs, and it was like kind of rudimentary but correct anatomy. And the teacher was just shocked because he had this understanding of a biological system, and clearly he must have studied it, a photo of it or a drawing of it. And so a lot of his understanding came through drawings and diagrams. And his mother had a stroke of genius when she bought him Dittmar's Guide to North American Reptiles. And I think this was also in 4th grade. And it was the first book he really wanted to read. And he just bore into it and forced those letters to behave, and in some ways overcame a large aspect of his dyslexia, which shows something about his will and determination, which is it's something else that made him unusual. And I remember this as a girl, was that he had this kind of non-judgmental openness in his sort of hunting sphere. He always wanted to catch the rarest, biggest, most beautiful creatures, but he was not deterred by failure. In fact, he was challenged by it. And this also translated to fish. So when he started to fly fish, and like with everything, he wanted to learn to do it his way, learned how to, tie his own flies, and basically kind of muddle through the whole excruciating process of learning about that sport on his own, which sort of made his knowledge very hard-won and personal. Like, it became part of his education. And what didn't work was just as valuable information to him as what did work. He would try things, and then, he would try a fly, he would try a cast, he would try a place in the river. And this as a fisherman, this is what all fishermen do. And if it doesn't work, you try something else. But the whole process was fascinating to him. The challenges continued to grow. Like, he just kind of made his way up that fishing ladder from rainbow trout to steelhead to brown trout to inevitably Chinook, and then the whole spectrum of Chinook, fall Chinook, spring Chinook, and different rivers and micro populations of Chinook, and always wanting to go for the toughest, strongest fish. And for a long time, no one was trying to catch Chinook, especially like a spring Chinook coming in hard and fast from the ocean on a fly, because they are not feeding, they're hell-bent on reaching their spawning grounds. And it took him, I think, 5 years to crack that code, to figure out just what would make a Chinook stop and consider his fly. And for 5 years he would go down into the rivers of the Tillamook Basin and sit there in his pram kind of across the bay from these gear fishermen that had these, big glinting treble hooks, and were, and these hooks are kind of irritants and intrusive and sort of artless, right? Sorry for all you fishermen who are gear fishermen, because there's absolutely a place for you. In this context, I think that Guido felt like it wasn't a fair fight, like fly fishing somehow represented meeting the fish on its own territory and giving it a fair chance and respecting it, in that you really learned as much as you possibly could before you even offered it something. It was a relationship almost between you and the fish, not this kind of extraction from the river. But anyway, these gear fishermen would watch him year after year and sort of joke and laugh and be like, God, what a fool, until he figured it out. And then he, started pulling huge fish out of there on his barbless hook, and their jaws dropped, of course. Anyway, so that's just to say his particular character and disposition was perfectly suited to fly fishing, the attention to detail, the bottomless patience, the love of learning, and of course, at the base of it all, just this absolute hunger to be in the river, to be in the wild, to be amongst, the trees and the creatures and standing in that current. And that's what he lived for. Yeah.
And lives for, because he's still around. We're almost talking about him all in the past here.
I know this is you're right. That's what he lives for. And you'll speak with him soon. He's very much alive and very much the same. Although, what changed for him was that, it's funny, he went to high school in Arizona, Verde Valley, and he went there primarily to hunt the mountain king snake. And his long pursuits of this snake resulted in, very, very minimal class participation, and in the end, no college diploma, which he just kind of shrugged off because he decided to go search for big brown trout in the Upper Deschutes River. But anyway, it was when the big kind of turning point in his life that I saw was when in like 1990, when the first analysis of Pacific salmon populations was done and showed just alarming results. Different populations had dropped from thousands to hundreds, or from thousands to one single fish. And so this was just like red alert for Oregon. And for Guido, it was just a call to battle. He was like, oh my God. And he understood what was going on. I mean, it wasn't rocket science. I mean, salmon need basically three things to survive. They need access to their birth rivers, they need cold, clean water, and they need spawning grounds. And, if you dam a river without a fish ladder, or if you pollute a river with, by agriculture or what have you, if you clear cut a river and the water warms up, trees are a really integral part of any healthy salmon river, but probably any healthy river, because they provide shade and all kinds of structure for the fish. When the trees fall or branches fall, those create kind of an underwater neighborhood for fish to hold, to spawn, to feed, to grow. Just this stuff wasn't really known. Why it wasn't widely known at the time. And so, and by the time, what Guido found was that by the time a salmon population became endangered, the river itself was degraded beyond repair. It was, the Endangered Species Act, when it was enacted for salmon, was, as Guido saw it, like the emergency room. So really all systems have failed at that point, and you've got a patient on life support, which wasn't really a conservation strategy. And so he started to think about the rivers that were still healthy in the Pacific Northwest, and thought, look, all this money, billions of dollars would be spent on trying to restore degraded salmon rivers, and to, not great effect. So his strategy started to develop, and it was the Stronghold strategy, which was protect the rivers that are healthy. It's a lot cheaper, a lot easier, and doable. So he kind of became an activist and, went back to school. And, I watched him kind of transform from this long-haired, bead-wearing hippie, to kind of a clean-cut.
He became a suit.
He kind of became a suit. And for him, he didn't care. It was all about and he understood that humans are just like animals. It's like you kind of have to fit in. You've got to wear what you need to wear to be acknowledged. You've got to do the dance, and so he learned how to do that, and he learned how to deal with human beings by studying them the same way he studied creatures. I mean, he really learned them, and he learned them so well, and he's so incredibly good with people, and like deeply charming and present and interested and curious. Like you would never know that he has this, that really he would rather be anywhere but, in a suit. No, that's not true. He just always would rather be in a river.
And why is his name not as well known? We've got Jane Goodall. We've got, I think, a Brute Gildacost with the orangutans. You've got the Cousteaus with underwater.
Yeah.
And he's the voice of the salmon. I think it's a bad, I don't know if you can say it's a bad analogy. He's the Lorax for the salmon, but he's not a well-known name. Anybody that's eating salmon these days from the Pacific, wild salmon, basically have him to thank.
Oh, that's so nice. I mean, I agree. So part of why I wanted to write this book was to make people fall in love with salmon. And I think that fish are harder for the general public to fall in love with. They're cold-blooded, they're underwater, they live, underwater, they're kind of mysterious. They show up, in the marketplace, but not a whole lot is known about them. But in fact, they have qualities that are amazing, like that we can identify with. I think anyway. I mean, when I started to learn about them, and salmon were originally freshwater creatures, and it was when the ice caps melted that they sensed a greater food source in the ocean, and over, God knows how many years, adapted their physiologies to process salt water. I mean, that alone is a staggering thing to do. They basically became like transformers.
Salt's a pretty noxious compound for aquatic or any organism.
Right? Yeah. And so they just like started to, yeah, exactly. And which is why they migrate, because they're those fragile, beautiful, translucent eggs would never survive in the ocean. And so after they kind of take off into the deep, dark Pacific, facing all kinds of predators and dangers. I mean, it's a very badass thing to do, really. I mean, these fish are kind of cool. I mean, it's like striking out for the big city, like, Mom, Dad, I'm going to try my luck in New York. I'm going to write a screenplay and go to LA. It's like, I'm going to go for those northern waters, and I'm going to get big, and I'm going to have a ton of eggs. And that's like the fish version of, fortune and fame, is like increasing your egg load and your biological kind of output, like more of my little fish have a chance to survive. So that was the driving force for them. And they swim as far as, 2,000 miles away. And then it's like Cinderella. It's like when the clock strikes midnight, when their biological clock goes off and it's time to spawn, they turn around and come all the way back to their birth river, which is like, nobody really gets how they do that. It's beyond mysterious. I mean, there are theories about navigating by the stars, that they're magnetically aligned, that they can detect a drop of their home river and, a gazillion cubic tons of salt water. Who knows? But they do, and this is partly why they create this incredible ecosystem, because they come back to where they were born, and after spawning, most all species die within weeks or days. And so what happens then is they deliver this nutrient bomb, because their bodies are filled with all those omegas. It's like the superfood of the ocean. And they die en masse, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of fish in the case of a place like Bristol Bay. And all those nutrients go into the ecosystem where everything feeds on them, including their baby fish, baby salmon. But, you understand why they're a keystone species, because like over 150 species rely on them, both, marine species and freshwater species, and mammals and rodents and frogs and insects and microbial life in the soil and the trees themselves. You cut open 1,000-year-old tree in the Pacific Northwest and you'll find nitrogen isotopes that are unique to marine systems. So even the trees have been built on salmon nutrients. So salmon coming back to their birth rivers is really, really important. This is something that people have understood slowly and in the past decade or two. And most people don't really get it, that there's this huge system, and salmon are like these, transporters of nutrients between these massive habitats, fresh and saltwater habitats. And that when you dam a river, it's basically, bam, you're not getting nutrients into that river. The watch isn't being rewound. And things start to fall apart. That whole ecosystem, which is kind of based on salmon, starts to erode, which is what alarmed Guido. And he was like, what's going to happen? This is like one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. And, if salmon stop, like the Atlantic populations had been lost many years earlier in Europe and on the east coast of America. And believe it or not, like rivers from Portugal to Norway used to be chock-a-block full of salmon. I mean, imagine like the Seine or the Rhine or the Thames. And it was basically ignorance and the Industrial Revolution, where factories were put on rivers, because rivers, of course, just take the waste away so neatly, destroyed the salmon habitat. And, Europe is just still struggling they're still trying to bring their salmon back, but it's incredibly hard. Anyway, Guido saw, wow, if that happened to Pacific salmon, the Northern Hemisphere would lose one of its most vital, important creatures. And that's been the gas in his tank, and it's motivated him to do incredible things.
At one point, did your observations of growing up with him and his story and you being a writer merge that you were going to tell his story?
That's a good question. I'll tell you exactly the moment. So when we go to our cabins on the Deschutes, and Guido inherited his and I inherited mine, and we go back there multiple times a year, and it's so great. There's no cell phone, there's no cell reception, there's no Wi-Fi, and you take a boat across a river, and it's just very remote. You're not driving around, there's nobody around, and so you really like go deep, with your conversations, and it's just quiet. And it's the joys of being in the river, and whatever that river is, you're just like, all the beeping and the buzzing just stops for a while, and it's like, peace and wind in the trees and the sound of the river and insects and birds. Anyway, that's where we would get together and catch up on our lives and our stories. And over the years, Guido's stories were becoming more and more kind of like noteworthy, if not outlandish. And he started to get into salmon conservation, and I listened as his mission kind of grew, and he started working in the Russian Far East, because if you look at the Pacific Rim, a map of the Pacific Rim, which we don't often see, if you buy Stronghold, you'll see this map right in the beginning of the book, because it's so critical to the story. the map is often bisected right down the middle, and you see either the west coast of America or the Far East, which has, Japan, the Koreas, China, and the Russian Far East, which is a very, wild and unpopulated part of the world. And the Sea of Okhotsk and the Bering Sea and all of these like rich northern waters where our fish swim to get big and strong. So our fish swim to Russia, a lot of them do. We don't know where they all go, but there have been huge fish caught off the coast of Kamchatka from like the Snake River. So there's definitely an exchange there. And really the whole arc from Northern California, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, Alaska, over to Kamchatka and the Russian Far East and Japan is one huge ecosystem, one big salmon ecosystem. So anyway, I was a Soviet studies minor, and I had studied in Russia and knew something about Russians. And when Guido started working over there, I started paying attention and asking questions like, wow, how are you doing conservation in Russia? It's a very different country to ours, with different values, and they also are massive. They've got so much land that conservation isn't really something they practice or even think about, because the Russian Far East is 11 time zones from Moscow. It's just huge. And so, they're not running out of things. Guido saw that when the Soviet Union fell apart in the early 90s, he saw, and this is what happened, all of a sudden everything was for sale. Development in this area around Kamchatka just ramped up because, like Alaska, it's not dissimilar to Alaska. There's lots of natural resources. There's oil, there's natural gas, there's ore, gold and whatnot. There are trees, all these things that, if you look to the south, to Asia, all of these things have run out and been used up. And really, Russia borders China. This is not far away. So so there's enormous pressure to develop this incredible salmon habitat over there, where it's home to like a great percentage of the world's wild salmon. So anyway, so he had been over there just trying to figure out, how to get these people to kind of wake up and realize that they could lose their salmon, and that salmon were a resource that were in the long run more valuable than like one of these extractive industries that would come in, totally screw up the land, like mining. It's the dirtiest industry in the world, and it would just completely pollute, a huge region. And then the mining industry is famous for not cleaning up their messes, and they use all kinds of poisons to extract the ore. Anyway, it's a pretty awful outcome. So his argument was that, the fish really sustain the whole region, and they feed people, and they feed the habitat, and they were worth fighting for. So that was his message, and it took a long time for them to get it. But back to the moment that you asked about, really rambling here. But so we were at our place on the Deschutes, and Guido was gearing up to go fishing, and we were just kind of lounging around. He's like, yeah, I could see he had a story to tell me, and he was kind of a little like, I don't know, nervous or just unlike him. He's like, yeah, I just got back from Moscow where I met with this oligarch, Oleg Deripaska. And Oleg Deripaska was not in the news at that point, but Guido knew that he was kind of a shady guy. Like, he knew, just like an animal knows, of danger. He's like, yeah, I met with him just, and I just basically, I got a meeting with him through, some other person. And And he basically just asked this guy, if he would help save, Russia's salmon. And at that point, I thought, okay, it's time to tell this story because what you're doing.
No one's going to believe what my cousin is doing.
No one's going to believe it. No one's going to believe it. He's so fearless. And I was really proud of him and nervous for him, and when he's nervous, it's like, there's a reason to be nervous because he's not very often nervous. He's a fearless guy. But he was getting into like a human habitat that was so rarefied and strange. And, very few people would have done what he did, which was just kind of walk right in, knock on the door and say, hey, salmon are valuable. You want to help me save them? So it was, and Oleg Deripaska didn't end up doing much. He helped him a little bit get a toehold in Moscow. But Guido's strategies in Russia were, he had a few that, and in the end, he's had a lot of success in Russia and has established a number of protected strongholds over there and millions of acres of incredible river. So he's managed to do the impossible in my estimation. But I thought at that point, gosh, the world is so full of bad news and depressing environmental stories, and this is actually a hopeful story, and it's an exciting story. And I thought I could weave in all these crazy adventures that he's had. And honestly, in the book, there's a lot of crazy adventures, but it's a fraction of what his life has actually been. I had to kind of cull, some of it because...
What were some of the stories that didn't make it in? Have you got one memorable one? Or one memorable story that didn't make it?
Yeah, let me just think here. Oh, God. I remember there's a lot, but the first one that comes to mind is when he was down in South America, down in the cloud forests of Chiapas, Mexico, and where he was cutting his teeth as a conservationist. He went into the forest he was showing the forest to some potential funders, and he was with some Mexican coworkers and some guides, and I think they came upon I hope I'm going to get the species right, a massive iguana, being iguana, but big as a person, massive, right? Yeah, I think it's iguana. And anyway, in Mexico, iguanas are food and they're eaten. And Guido knew this because he'd been living down there, and he looked at like the Mexicans next to them who saw the iguana, and they were about to run for the iguana to basically kill it. And Guido sprinted, to beat them, and caught the iguana, tied it up with a rope at their campsite. And in the night, the iguana just marched around and took down all of their tents. And still, Guido insisted on taking it back to the natural zoo that he was working at. And so they had it in the car, where it was just like a wild, crazy thing. And
it's Komodo dragon size at that point.
Yeah, oh yeah. And he smuggled it into a hotel, kept it in the bathroom, and then it escaped and chomped on a pillow, and feathers were everywhere. And the dragon, the lizard wouldn't allow Guido to take the pillow out of its mouth. So he wrestled with it and took it to the zoo with this down pillow in its mouth. But anyway, there's just a lot of crazy stories, and you can ask him too. A lot of crazy snake stories as well. I mean, he had at University of Oregon in his dorm room, he had, this is in the book though, 2 mountain king snakes, 2 rattlesnakes, and a 13-foot Burmese reticulated python. Reticulated Burmese python? Yeah, those were his friends.
In college, I had mason jars full of frogs and then a pet praying mantis for a while, and my roommates were not cool with that. or the freezer being full of just dead bugs for entomology. I can't imagine being in a dorm with snakes.
I know. I know. And when the spring would come and the rattlers would kind of come out of hibernation and start rattling, he would just like crank up his music louder.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you piece together everything so well? Like I said, it reads like fiction when you're telling the stories about going down the rivers in Kamchatka and the boats. Was that just Guido sitting back and telling you?
No, that's a good question. So I did a ton of reporting for the book, and I just didn't want it to read like that. I wanted it to read like a great story. So I asked around about all the expeditions, and I didn't just ask him. I asked, other people at the Wild Salmon Center and at the camp, like the Krutogorova expedition, for example, which is a major chapter in the book. Pete Soverel, who was Guido's partner at the Wild Salmon Center, said, like, oh, it was the worst trip ever. The steelhead fishing was awful. And Guido was like, no, that trip was really interesting. And so I started looking into it, and I started interviewing like the scientists that had been there. And I was like, whoa, there's a story here. So I did like so many interviews for that, because everyone had their own version of the story, and it was 20 years earlier. And so Guido told me stories, but I reported around him all the time. There's only a few places in the book where it was just Guido telling me something. And then, I kind of picked out a narrative for his life, which was his life. But, it's almost like we all have this. All of our lives are stories, but do we look back and make sense of them? And I was looking at his life, and I was looking at the themes, that might possibly be through lines for a book. And I saw a theme with maps, and I saw a science theme, and some others that I could really structure a book around. And so I just made some choices. And, the key was to make the story flow and to never, let the reader off the hook, so to speak. And so that's what I tried for. And for me, the stakes were high, because it was like, this is a chance to spread the word. This is a chance to turn people on to the magic of an intact ecosystem. And and I'm a big fan of your whole approach to, bonding to your local river and your stream, because it's so key. If people, they can hear about rivers, but even better is to establish a relationship with a river, so it becomes this like part of your life, and this living organism that changes with every week, every day, and is like a portal for you into nature. And so I was hoping to activate people to like the miraculous natural systems on our planet, which are kind of in danger. We all know that. Sucks, but there you have it. And, there's just too many stupid people who think that they don't matter or don't see them. So I felt like an urgency, like there was a race to get this information out there and to paint a super exciting, beautiful picture so people would stay with it until the end, and then close the book and say, I get it, So that was my aim. And it was a beast, Rob. It was a beast of a, are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, because my electricity just went off again. Yeah, it was harder than I ever imagined it would be, and yeah.
Is there action you want readers and listeners to take? I don't want them to just read and put the book down. Is there something? Is there a long-term goal with writing the book, or do you hope something turns out from it besides just educating people and?
Oh, yeah. I think that a lot of people have read the book and become, interested in, what can they do, what they can do. And certainly, like Guido will talk to you about this shortly, but there's this big campaign up in Bristol Bay, fighting the Pebble mine, which would destroy like the second biggest salmon stronghold in the world. I think 2 years ago, Pebble Bay saw 60 million sockeye salmon come in to its rivers and lakes. So it is a really intense, beautiful, powerful ecosystem, and these idiots are trying to dig a mine at the headwaters of the primary salmon rivers, and it would destroy the whole ecosystem, of course. And this was almost destroyed under Obama. The whole thing, everyone knew it was a terrible idea. And but under Trump, of course, like in his first weeks of office, it was green lighted. So it's back on track, and I'll let Guido will talk more about that. But the problem with the fossil fuel industry is that they just have bottomless pockets, and they can outweigh and outspend conservationists. So it's like you just have to fight a different war. You have to fight a smart, strategic war. But they can always use contributions for sure. And the Wild Salmon Center, and they've got a fantastic website, and you can read all about it with gorgeous pictures and characters, and you can really kind of see how amazing their work has been. So that's one thing. And then I think Guido would agree, as you would agree, that getting out to your rivers, getting out there, just getting outside and learning about it, and learning about like what makes a river healthy and what's hurting it, and what might come back to life if it got cleaned up. And the rivers on Earth are like, it's almost like the veins and capillaries and arteries of a human body. They are the circulatory system for the planet. Even though we've paved over them, they're still, under that concrete. They are pumping water through the interior. So it's just kind of cool, it's all connected. So, and a river runs through it.
Exactly. Can I talk about steelhead fishing now?
Yeah.
What's it like fishing? I've never fished out west for real steelhead. What is the Deschutes like for anglers who've not been there yet?
Okay, I want to. Yeah, I feel like this is prime Guido question.
Okay. What's it like fishing with him then? Do you just sit back and watch?
I can talk about that. Guido knows so much about the Deschutes. He's been watching it for his whole conscious life. And so he knows all like the little populations of steelhead. And like near our cabins, there's a creek that's like a seasonal creek. And that creek has its own population of steelhead. And those steelhead, it's fascinating because, well, let me just talk about steelhead in general for a minute. For those who don't know, and maybe I shouldn't be talking about steelhead, but I will anyway. Okay, I just don't want to repeat what everyone might know. But to me, steelhead are fascinating because there's a central mystery to like why a rainbow trout goes to the ocean, and becomes a steelhead. I mean, I think a lot of it is food driven, but who knows, So that's what a steelhead is, a rainbow trout that goes to the ocean. And some ichthyologists would argue that it becomes a salmon. It actually kind of changes its specification, and it definitely changes physically. But steelhead aren't like the rest of the salmon species. Like the Pacific salmon species, and there are 6 of them, they all have kind of a life history, which is what describes their behavior. They're born in a certain part of the river, and then they take a certain amount of time to mature. And then they head to the ocean, and they'll stay out in the ocean for, say, pink and chum salmon. We'll stay out for 2 years pretty much, and then head home. Chinook, 4 to 6 years. Coho and sockeye, they all have their own kind of specific program. and they eat different food, and they go to different parts of the ocean, and they spawn in different parts of the river. So, but it's all kind of organized. Steelhead just kind of strike out, swim out, sometimes alone, sometimes with other steelhead. Not a lot is known about them, but they are fierce fighters, and they're beautiful fish, and they're mysterious, and they're rare, and they're one of the more sensitive species to environmental change because they usually have the farthest to swim. So all the species of salmon swim different distances, and I think this is super cool, they eat enough to get home. So, and that also determines the quality of their flesh, and their price in the marketplace. So like chum and pink salmon are kind of the low man on the totem pole because they spawn right inside the mouth of the river, and their flesh starts to kind of deteriorate. All salmon kind of start to die when they come back into the river. Wait, except steelhead. I'll get back to that.
So I have a theory about steelhead are the cuckoos of the fishing world because they're laying their eggs. The eggs hatch. They eat all the nutrients that the salmon died and left behind, but they're not contributing any of the nutrients themselves.
Interesting. Well, they do because but okay, so steelhead are the one. I mean, we don't know if they're a species of salmon or not, but they can go multiple times. They can go back out to the ocean. But they do. I think they do. You should ask Guido, but they do contribute.
You don't have 100,000 corpses just breaking down.
No. I suppose it's opportunistic. But anyway, so they like Chinook tend to spawn at the tops of rivers, and so they have farther to swim, and so the challenges are greater. They have dams, they have human interference, and so and their meat is incredible because of that. They've packed on more fat because they have farther to swim. It's like gas in your tank. So anyway, they're special and rare and mysterious. They're hard to catch, which is why Guido loves them.
I love them too. I just don't live where they live.
What do you fish for?
Carp, snakehead, striped bass.
Cool.
The snakehead are the new ones in the river. You weren't here when they were there. They breathe air. It takes about 7 hits to kill one with a baseball bat.
What?
Yeah, they can live out of water for about a week if they're wet.
No.
Yeah, they're known as the Frankenfish.
That's scary. Oh my God.
And apparently, I don't eat fish, but they are the prime table fare. And they grow up 5 pounds the first year. So they don't have all the heavy metals and toxins that a catfish the same age would have, or the same size.
It's like a new species.
Yeah, a guy dumped them in 2004, and they're all up and down. They're now someone just found a whole bunch in a pond in Georgia. They've infiltrated eastern. People dump them all over.
It's like, oh my God, that's fascinating. It sounds like that's going to make it through the apocalypse.
Yeah, and I caught my first one in the tidal basin.
Oh my God. So maybe they migrate?
Oh, they migrate. They're like salmon in the springtime. They jump over any kind of rocks and obstructions. They'll bounce into the drift boat. They'll knock into your oars. And then you've got people from Asia that are familiar with them and know how good they are to eat, and they just snag them when they come up to breathe air. They can use their gills, but they prefer oxygen because it's more pure. And as soon as they come up to breathe, there are guys in these eddies just sitting on rocks for 10 hours a day. And they just snag them with a treble hook and drag them on shore. It's pretty crazy to see. You
are blowing my mind. Okay. I have to go read about these fish. Snakefish? What are they called?
Northern snakehead, Channa argus.
Snakehead.
Channidae. And they're native to Kamchatka, the Amur River Valley.
Oh, okay. Snakehead. That's interesting. Yeah, something that, I'm sure Guido must know about them, but he kind of discovered a species in the course of his career over that thrives over there near the Amur on the Russian mainland, Siberian taimen, which feature in the book. And they've got similar kind of wacky qualities in that they have been known to like launch onto land and eat rodents and ducks, and they grow to be, I don't know how big, when they start feeding on adult chum, and then they start to grow massive.
Yeah, when you're eating a chum salmon, that's the size of a Labrador dog almost. That's huge.
I know. They grow up to be 100 pounds, and some say 200. And so nothing's known about them. And so Guido's been over there in Russia for the past few years conducting science on these like dinosaur fish. And I went on one of these expeditions with him, and it was spooky because these fish can like, turn your rafts over, and you don't really want to make them mad.
They look at you like when snakeheads come up to breathe, their eye looks at your eye. There's an actual consciousness to them almost. And it sounded like at one scene in the book, the taimen were doing that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the fishermen on our expedition who, is a super tough guy, and he was really spooked by this fish. It kind of, something brushed his wader and kind of a riffle, and he looked down, and there was this huge tail just swishing away. And he was like, shit, that's the biggest fish I've ever seen. And then it turns around and stares at him. And
that kind of made the hair on my neck prickle up when I was reading that.
Totally. And the thing is, these fish have never encountered humans, and they're the apex predator. So they're fearless. And so there's a certain like audacity to their behavior, which is a little kind of like, well, you don't know what they're going to do. So pretty exciting. And, these rivers are just so far away from everything. Takes like 3 days to get over there, and there's helicopter rides and
Yeah,
and
those
then
helicopters are pretty sketchy.
they're sketchy.
Oh, I had a client where a customer once come into the fly shop I worked at saying while they were refueling one, it just exploded with the crew and all their luggage, and they were just sitting on the tarmac in the middle of nowhere with nothing.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's the story you don't want to hear, because Guido and his cohorts, kind of believe in the sturdiness of these old Mi-5s, whatever they are, old Soviet helicopters that they got out and used basically as taxis. And it's the only way to get around in that part of the world and in Kamchatka, because there are no roads, no infrastructure. But they're huge helicopters, and you're at the mercy of these pilots, which are, who can be very temperamental too. And also the conditions there, you can't fly, when there's any kinds of weather or clouds. I mean, Guido, you should ask him about his recent close call when he was headed to the Uda River. It took them, ask him about his sketchy helicopter ride. And, this is a typical story for him. He has these near-death brushes.
And they're just nonchalant. Somebody ran a red light on my way to CVS, but he'll talk about a helicopter almost crashing in Siberia.
Exactly. Yeah. Just another work day.
Do you have Thanksgiving dinners with him? And other family events?
Yeah, we do. And we have... And then we have a week after Christmas where we do we have a week up at the Deschutes with kids and my brother and sister, and it's so much fun. We play music and hike and fish and drink wine, and it's the best.
Does any of the Russian vodka follow you guys back from Russia?
Believe me, yes. Vodka has taken up a residence in our lives, and I've become a little bit of a believer too. It's a very clean alcohol.
Do you have a brand preference? We're Russian standard here. That's our my in-laws are from Soviet Union. So,
Where are you?
well, they were outside Kiev back then, so they won't say they're not Ukrainian.
Yeah.
So when I go to my in-laws, it's all Russian. There's no American food. There's no English spoken. They've been here
Wow.
since the 70s.
Wow.
They still do everything the hard way. My wife was making pumpkin bread the other day, and she's got a KitchenAid mixer, but she still had to mix it in a bowl by hand. I was like, you Russians, there are modern conveniences. Please use them.
Man, I've never seen a tougher people.
My father-in-law will go out and edge the sidewalk with a kitchen knife. I'm like, there's easier ways. You're 80 years old. You don't have to work this hard.
It's the old way.
And he'll still ride his bike for 3 or 4 hours and just go out and around Ohio.
Wow.
I don't get it.
Wow.
They do not quit. You're right.
Very impressive.
Yeah. Well, how about I ask you some of the non questions? Is there anything else about the book we didn't cover, or Life with Guido?
Gosh. Well, I mean, there's so much. I mean, I think that when I decided to write this book, of course, he had to be involved, and he was totally game. You know, his one question was, do you think we can reach the soccer moms? So it's been this incredible journey with him, and we've gotten super close. But we have an understanding of each other, I think, that goes back to childhood, which made the process really fun. It was not without its challenges, but, we came out like having had this incredible adventure together, and are continuing to have that adventure. But yeah, so no, you're going to have a great conversation with him. You know, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else to tell you, and I feel like I've talked a lot.
Well, just tell listeners they just got to read the book.
You guys have to read this book. It's a really great read.
My parents cut out the New York Times article, and my wife picked up the book for me. So, and I sat on the back porch and just cranked through it.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's that kind of book. That's what I keep hearing. The Wall Street Journal ran an article a few weeks ago that was like a total rave, which I was super psyched about because that reviewer really got it. But yeah, it's like you've got this great character and a great life that carries you through learning about all this cool stuff, but you don't really feel like you're learning, right? I mean, that was my aim, was to make it effortless and interesting, to learn about this incredible ecosystem and salmon and all of that. So yeah, please buy Stronghold.
Yay.
And then go and give it 5 stars on Amazon.
Awesome. All right, so we got some other questions for you now.
All right.
Hot dogs, do you put ketchup or mustard on them?
I'm a mustard girl.
All right. Favorite Harrison Ford movie?
Oh, God. I'll have to go with Raiders.
Nice. If you could go back in time to see an athlete or a band or both in their prime, who would you go see?
Oh, my God. Wow. So revealing, right? Okay, let me just think a minute. I think I would see, just for old time's sake, the Grateful Dead.
Nice. Still trying to get my daughter into them. My wife will not let me play only studio albums on road trips.
Okay.
That should have been part of our discussion when we started dating 20 years ago. She was never into the jam band scene. Do you have any irrational phobias? I guess reptiles would have to been crossed off the list a long time ago.
Yeah. I do. I don't know if it's irrational, though. I mean, I grew up in earthquake country, and so I shouldn't be nervous about them, but I am. And it's pretty rational in my part of the world. I'm nervous in my bedroom. I have this big redwood tree, and I'm nervous that tree is going to fall into the house. And like, what am I going to do when that happens? When I start to hear it groan at night, and what am I going to do? Am I going to like roll off the bed, under the bed, Like structurally, where's the best place to be? I'm constantly thinking about the structures in my house when the big one hits and the tree falls on the house.
Tree
Yeah.
falling here, the last 2 years, except for the last 8 weeks, has been exceptionally rainy. And trees falling and branches falling on people is actually a very new fear
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
houses. There are houses here that just get destroyed.
Yeah, it's a big thing. Yeah, it's happening out here too. So I don't think it's totally irrational,
Yeah,
but
there's
but
the maple
weird.
right here. It's half dead outside my window in my office that we're going to get taken down this year.
Yeah,
Sooner than
like
better.
by maple. Yeah. So it's like half foliage. Yeah, that's so sad. It's sad to lose a tree, but they are dangerous.
Yeah, and if it falls, it's most likely going to go on my neighbor's cars.
Yeah.
That's the other worry. I don't want Jim and Bonnie coming over here all upset one day
Yeah, totally.
in her overalls.
I thought of another fear.
Oh,
Yeah. Um, being in tunnels and underwater, like on Bay Area Rapid Transit, on our train, like under the bay. That freaks me out.
I've only
like,
been on the BART above ground.
yeah. I mean, I can't, people do it every day. I don't do it every day. But when I'm on there, I'm like, okay, what if an earthquake now? And I'm underwater.
That'd be like the fictitious movie from Seinfeld, Chunnel. Something bad takes place in the tunnel between France and England.
No, it's like, I'm not supposed to be here. I mean, I have that feeling a lot. It's one of those things that about modern life that gets normalized. Same as flying around and airplanes and stuff like that. It's like, oh, it's normal. And then you look out and you're like, actually, this is not normal. Hurtling through space.
What are y'all giving out for Halloween this year?
Oh, that's a good question. I think apple caramel pops. That's my son's favorite. Kit Kats, Twix, and you can't give any fruit or anything like that. Maybe some Snickers.
I like the Snickers.
Yeah, Tootsie Rolls. Still like Tootsie Rolls.
Yeah. Old fashioned but good.
Yeah.
What's your favorite part of Thanksgiving dinner?
Oh my God. I do love a great bite of juicy turkey with some gravy and stuffing mashed on top. Yum. And the next bite is a little bit of gravy and cranberry sauce, kind of alternating a little bit. Green beans, slivered almonds.
I can't wait for
good.
Thanksgiving. I'm smoking the turkeys this year. It's going to be awesome.
Oh, yum.
Another food question. Who's got the best sandwich in Berkeley?
Oh, my God. The best sandwich. Geez. Oh, no. I don't know. Geez, I'm coming up blank. Southie. I think Southie is like around me. A place called Southie has some pretty good sandwiches.
What's the last book you read?
Oh, good question. I have been plowing through an Italian writer named Ilana Ferrante, my brilliant friend.
How do you spell the first name?
It's
my wife is an
Elena, Elena,
okay.
Ferrante, Ferrante. And I've spent a lot of time in Italy, and that's been a super good read. There's 4 of these though, so if you get in, prepare for commitment.
Okay. Well, Tucker, I think that wraps up my questions. We'll let you get on with your windy day.
Thank you, Rob. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for writing the book. It was really awesome. I'll probably read it again.
Thank you for featuring it and for having us both on. It's an honor.
And do you have a link to your publisher? or where
Yeah,
people can pick
you
up?
can just Google. You can go if you Google Tucker Malarkey. My random house should pop up, and there's lots of same as Amazon. There's lots of reviews and quotes and blurbs posted about the book. But you're right. I need to make a website. I'm bad about that kind of thing.
Well, thank you
And
so
hey,
much.
good luck with your urban guiding. I think it's awesome. And
Thanks.
if I'm ever back there, I'll look you up. And
Please do.
who knows, I might come do a reading in the DC area. So I'll give you a heads up.
It'd be awesome. We can go fish. This time of year, it's all the sewage outflow near the airport. That's where we're fishing.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm down.
All right, Tucker. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast. For more information or to contact Rob, please go to www.robsnowhite.com. This podcast is brought to you by Freestone Productions at freestoneproductions.com.